questions at the end of our panel, and if you have questions, you can submit them via the chat box at any time. If you can't find the chat box, you can always raise your hand and we can unmute you when it's time to ask your question at the end of our panel. We're also doing CEUs for this session. Since this is a virtual session, we're going to try to do this as closely as we would if it was an in-person session. So we're going to ask that you use the chat box to go ahead and submit your name. And we're going to ask you to do that at the beginning and the end of the session, just as though you were checking in during an in-person session at the beginning and the end, so that we can make sure that we give you your CEUs. And I think that's all that I have in terms of housekeeping. If you're having any issues with audio, we do recommend that you log out and log back in. That's unfortunately something that isn't something we can correct from our end, but usually that takes care of the problem. So again, welcome. Our fantastic panelists today are going to be speaking with you about our work in advocacy. And I have to assume that because you've selected this session out of the several amazing sessions that were being offered during this time, that you also think advocacy is very important. You're all already advocates for your clients, your programs, your community, and it's your passion that you bring to those efforts that make you successful in serving folks in your community. But that's only one piece of the puzzle to prevent and end homelessness in our state. We must also be advocates for smart, evidence-based policies at our local, state, and federal levels. This is especially important now in the middle of both a health and housing crisis. COVID has brought disparities into focus for decision makers, and that means we have an opportunity to find and use that silver lining that we're finding during this pandemic. Now is when we need to be having regular conversations with our elected officials to educate and to motivate them around what our communities need right now. And if you were in the opening session with Regina Cannon this morning, hopefully, like me, you were moved by what she put forward as our lessons learned during this pandemic. And you heard her call us all to action, to rise up with one voice and to advocate for change, to bring that passion that we have in our communities when serving our clients to City Hall, to our state legislature, to Congress, and yes, even to the polling booth next week. So today, our panelists are going to be talking about their experiences with communicating with elected officials and how we can use that communication to change hearts and minds. I'm going to ask each one of our panelists to answer briefly a quick question, but as I'm doing so, I'm also going to ask all of you, our attendees, to be thinking about this question as well and what your answer is. So I'm going to start with Kara, and this is going to be a question for all of you. Why are you an advocate? Kara, would you like to introduce yourself again and then answer that question?
My name is Kara Coleman. I am housing supervisor at Allegan County Community Mental Health for the homeless assistance programs in Allegan County. I've been doing this work since about 2003 consistently, but I've also did a lot of volunteer experience in college for about 4 years there. So I've pretty much been in almost every homeless sector there is: DV, youth, VASH, FSS, mental health, substance use with repre housing and permanent supportive housing, PATH and SOAR, ESG and ESP. So over my, 17 or so years of experience, have kind of touched a lot of different bases of homelessness, and have through the years seen the importance of advocacy to really do a few things. Give voice to those that are disenfranchised, who don't always have the opportunities to speak up for themselves, because obviously when you're homeless, you're busy trying to take care of basic needs, and people aren't always great at speaking up for themselves. I think the other thing I think is important with advocacy is I feel like I can give a voice to articulate the needs and barriers that are easily resolved by just simple policy changes that can remove a barrier for someone, like we did with the IDs in the state of Michigan, and getting birth certificates for people a lot more quickly and a lot easier. Simple things like that can go a long way to help people access housing. I think the other thing is just to bring awareness. For me, it's really about homelessness, and especially those with criminal histories due to mental health and substance use disorders.
Let me ask. Yeah, say yes. We'll do something.
Sorry, again, can you make sure you're on mute during this session? And I'm just going to ask our panelists to have their camera
on. The other thing is just to bring more understanding to the complex issue of homelessness. We know housing is a solution ultimately for homelessness, but there's so much more to helping people maintain housing and stability. And so it's a very complex issue. And then we all know money isn't the only thing that fixes this problem. And so we need to be creative about solutions. And so I think it's important to go to legislators, whether that's locally at the state or the federal level, to advocate for solutions beyond just the financial fixes. What else can we do to promote community change and collaboration efforts? Again, reducing regulations that will promote housing success.
Thank you. Katie, how about you? Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and then tell us why you're an advocate?
Yes, absolutely. Hi, everybody. My name is Katie Giza. I'm the Continuum of Care Coordinator with the Homeless Action Network of Detroit. My Continuum of Care serves the areas of Detroit, Highland Park, and Hamtramck. And so prior to coming to this position, I did a lot of direct service work with families in a number of different capacities, from being a targeted case manager to working in a substance use facility for women with co-occurring mental health and substance abuse, from working as an educator in a variety of settings. And so in that work, all of those different jobs working directly with people, I spent a lot of time working on expressed needs that families identified that they wanted to work on. So we would set goals and we would try to work towards those goals. But across the board, in whatever setting, whatever job position I had, whatever capacity I was working with families across the board, I would find myself constantly running into systemic issues that were not of the families creating. We were constantly working to address issues that were not of the families doing. We were spending so much time trying to jump through hurdles that systems had created, ways that the families unintentionally were falling through loopholes, ways that they were being excluded from services even though they needed them, ways that they were unintentionally being told, like, hey, you're not in crisis yet, so come back later when you're in crisis. We can't help you until then. And so really just bumping into these problems again and again, that the families had no creation, but we were spending all of our time addressing those things instead of getting to address their expressed needs, their expressed desires. We were just jumping through all of these hurdles time and again. And I realized that I didn't want to spend my whole life helping families navigate unjust systems if I could, through advocacy, work to help make systems more just. And so I switched kind of goals and gears of how I switched career paths of what my job is, and I've now tried to be more active in advocating with legislators and with policymakers and doing what I can in my system to help inform policy. So that we can minimize those systemic barriers, so that we can minimize those systemic injustices, and so that our systems can better meet the expressed needs of those who are impacted by them, and meet people where they're at. And so that's kind of what's driven my passion for this work and driven why I'm here.
Thank you, Katie. Last, Lynn, how about you introduce yourself and answer why you're an advocate?
I'm Lynn Raymond. I'm the director of the Lakeshore Housing Alliance, which is the continuum of care for Ottawa County on the west side of the state. I'm also an elected official. I was elected to the Holland City Council a year ago next week. So I could really echo a lot of what Kara and Katie have said, in particular Katie, in the sense that I began to, because of my experience in direct service, whether it be with refugees on the border in Texas or human rights work in Central America, or the work that we're doing now with folks who are experiencing homelessness, we could address particular issues and barriers and challenges that people were facing on a day-to-day basis. But also began to really recognize that we were spinning our wheels because systemically the system was stacked against them. And so it really felt like at some point neutrality, and this is what Regina Cannon said this morning, and I wrote it down because I thought it was so brilliant, that neutrality simply became not an option. Like we just had to begin to step up and begin to talk about the systemic issues. Of course, this is people, all of you on the call do this at one level or another for the people that you're working with. And I made a change very similar to Katie's, where I was working with direct service and felt like I needed to take a look at the larger picture and include advocacy in that process. And so really the continuum of care really gives us an opportunity to do that. So that's why I'm an advocate.
Thank you. And I learned quite a bit about all three of you. It's always nice to know what moves us to be in this world and how we evolve and how we're thinking about advocacy and the changes that we have the power to make within our systems and for our communities. So Lynn, you mentioned that you are an elected official. So as an elected official sitting on the other side of that table, when advocates speak to you, what kind of messaging or approach do you find to be the most effective in that role?
Well, this is a great question, and I think that I would have answered this question differently a week ago. Because over the course of the last year or so, as an elected official, I've been able to see a variety of styles of protest, for lack of a better word, or engagement, and I think that a week ago I might have said, it's good for you to make sure that you're engaging, writing letters, attending meetings, making public comment, and really kind of putting folks into a box of it's your responsibility to educate the elected official. And I think there is some truth to that, because we don't know everything, so it's helpful to get some education. And the reason I say a week ago is because a week ago at the Holland City Council meeting, we had actually, for the first time, as far as I've been told, for the first time in history, or the council meeting was actually shut down because of some protesters who had come actually to several meetings and had tried to make their voice heard, and were I think frustrated by the process that we were asking them to be a part of, and so they began to chant, and so the meeting was shut down briefly. And in conversations I've had over the course of the last week or so, what I've come to believe is that it's, and this gets back to also something Regina Cannon talked about this morning, which is power and how we cede power as elected officials. And I think one way we do that is by allowing people to engage with us respectfully, of course, but to engage with us in the way that makes the most sense for them, their community, the issue that they've brought to us. So I think that that's just me, and I don't represent, of course, all elected officials, and I think that most elected officials that I've spoken with, and as I said earlier, it is important to make sure that you engage and educate, and consistent communication is really helpful. That's one of the things that I've noticed over the last year, is that whether it's a years-long behind-the-scenes advocacy that is slow and in gaining strength, or if it's rapid organizing to a particular issue, the key really for me was always making sure that I had all of the information that I needed to have. So while I'm reassessing what it means to hear what people are saying and how we hear that, I also really appreciate regardless of how you present yourself to us publicly, it's important to make sure that we know who you are, that we have contact information, that we have, you know, enough research and data or whatever it is that is important to you, that we have all that information as well, because that way we can make much better, much more educated decisions. So yeah, I think that's, I hope that was helpful.
Yes, and it's good to hear that even on that other side of the table, that your experience, again, evolves based on your exposure to different messages and to different ways of communicating. And that's ultimately what we want our elected officials to do, right? Is we want them to hear us and to learn from us and to evolve in the way that they're thinking about these kinds of things. I'm going to put you on the spot, Lynn, because we have a little bit of time. I didn't ask you this before, but have there been ways of communicating that you automatically felt like undermined or eliminated the power of the message that the person was trying to put forward? Are there things we should avoid when we're communicating to our elected officials?
Well, and this may be different for all elected officials, what it means to be respectful, I think. So there might have been some council members last week who were offended by the protest that was staged. So I think that making sure that you're not, that there aren't personal attacks, that you're talking always about your issue as opposed to the personal, the individual that you're trying to address, I think is really key. I think the other thing that I forgot to mention when I was talking earlier, I think it's really important for you to find your allies on whatever group you're addressing, be it a board of education, a city council, a county commission, a state representative, up to the federal level. Make sure you find your ally. You know, look at the people who are sitting at the table and who do you think would be on your side? Who do you think you can touch with your story? And I think it's important to reach out, particularly to those people who you think might be sympathetic to the issue that you're bringing forward.
Thank you for that. Before I go on to the next question, I see that we have had some people join late. So just a reminder, everyone is on mute, but if you have questions at the end of our panel, we're going to be taking questions from the audience. So feel free to use the chat box and you can send those questions in at any time. We'll just hold on to them till the end. And if you need CEUs, we are giving those for this session. I'll need you to check in with the chat box. Just need your name and that you're here for the CEUs. And I'll have you do that at the beginning and at the end of this session so that we can make sure we award you for the CEUs for that. So Kara, I'm going to turn to you next. Lynn talked about making allies and we talked about being respectful. We know that elected officials often approach issues differently, depending on which side of the aisle that they're on. What has been successful for you when you're speaking to both Democrats and Republicans in your advocacy work?
Yeah, so I work in Allegan County. I live in Kent County. So Western Michigan tends to be a little more Republican leaning. And so, of course, it's important to, I think, first of all, understand the ideology of both sides, reading the platforms of each party to know, what they're really working on for the next 4 years. Usually they come out every 4 years with each presidential election. And so really knowing those is helpful to speak to the platform itself. But then beyond that, to know each individual representative that you're speaking to, whether that's at the local level, at the state level, the federal level, a lot of times they'll each have their quote pet projects or their interests, things they're very specifically interested in moving the needle on. And so what I found is, like specifically to Allegan County with Mary Whiteford, is she's a huge advocate for mental health and substance use disorder changes in our systems of care. And so for me, I found it helpful, she's also a Republican, to lean in on the connection between homelessness and persons with substance use and mental health issues and the barriers that they face, especially related to criminal justice as well. We know a lot of people end up incarcerated where they should have probably been hospitalized for issues of mental health and substance use. And so really leaning in on those kind of type changes has been helpful. connecting it back to that specifically for her, what she represents Allegan County. And then I think understanding with the platforms too, I think with each party, you can really make some inroads if you know their platform. Republicans tend to be more small government, more individual freedoms. And so how can I speak to those individual freedoms, especially when it comes to the barriers people are facing when they're homeless? Because a lot of times, as I think Katie alluded to, you have families that there's just these systemic barriers to them getting into housing because of credit, because of criminal history, because of sometimes race, depending on where you're located as well. And so how can I then, for at least from the Republican platform, bring that, though what they're really saying they're supporting, if you support individual freedoms, then we need to, get rid of these barriers. They're also a party of deregulation, right? And so I know there's a lot of regulations that impede housing. So how can I speak to those deregulations that I know is going to support access to housing? With the Democrats, I look more at the social justice kind of issues and social change, and getting at specifically the LGBTQ plus issues and what the barriers they may face in housing as well. They're really champions of those causes. And so really knowing and understand each party, but then going a step further, I will do my research on each candidate that I'm speaking to, whether it's local, federal, or state. I'm really going to try to find out as much as I can about that individual and what are they really all about? What do they support? What do they not support? And if they don't support something, why? Because can I find an inroad if they're not really seeing a housing first approach as being helpful? How can I go beyond and navigate that that resistance to that, and why is that there? And then educate on why housing first works, and showing the data and what we know about what works. And then the other thing I found with Mary Whiteford's office, what was really helpful the first time I went into her office and visited her was we actually talked to the staffers, and one of the staffer was not really supportive of any agendas related to ending homelessness, kind of more of that pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of mentality. However, Mary Whiteford was not seeing things that same way. So when I got a chance to talk to her, got a very different perspective. And but I also found out from her was that when Mary comes in, Representative Whiteford comes to Allegan County to do her local town hall meetings, I was provided some inside information about which meetings are less attended, which would give me the opportunity to spend more time with her on the homeless housing issues in Allegan County specifically. And so just kind of that inside information is helpful to know. The other thing, it really is important if you're talking, especially locally, know your local data, know what is the impacts of housing in your community, what's lacking and why. But who's homeless, and what you understand about your data, why people are homeless. The other thing is, like I said, with Representative Whiteford's office, finding out sometimes what the staffer's perspective is may not always match up with what the representative is. So having an understanding of that and continuing to ask questions. And then also, I think Lynn to this too, is make sure you have your business cards handy, something to leave them with to follow up with you on. I know some representatives are more better at follow up than others. And so continuing to, of course, reach out on a regular basis, especially when there's legislation coming up that's really important. I know for Kent County, I had a lot of great feedback from Tommy Brand. It's the county I live in, so I advocate there as well as Allegan County where I work. And he's always been great with not only just email follow-up, but even through Facebook and then even phone calls. I know personally I have an LPC for my, my position as well. And so we all know there was some stuff that came out about a year ago with the licensed professional counselors and some changes they were proposing there. And so I got I emailed and called Tommy Brand on that issue as well. And not only did I receive emails back, I received phone calls every step of the way for where that legislation was in the process from Representative Brand. So those kind of things can be really helpful when you make those connections, as well as making sure you give your contact. I provide both work and personal because I want to be available for them, because I know that they tend to work longer hours sometimes. So if I need to if it's okay for them to call me back at night, I don't have a problem with that, because I'd rather have that conversation than not have the conversation. And if it can be done in person or over the phone, it really helps make that personal connection with that individual. And I think the other thing is telling stories, so if you have some successes of what's worked in the community or why, that's always helpful, not to just focus on what's going wrong, but what's gone right and why it's gone right, and how can then we bring more of that to our communities is always helpful as well. Because sometimes something might work, but it would work in a bigger way if we had some regulatory changes. And so, promoting those ideas is helpful as well. So that's kind of how I've approached the issue with both sides of the aisle. And then, of course, every time I talk to each representative, whether Republican or Democrat, I'm always focusing on, we need to come together regardless of party affiliation, and we need to work on solutions together to help those that are homeless, because it's going to take all of us working together. I think, like the keynote speaker said this morning, it takes all of us working together to implement changes. And so I really highlight that too.
Thank you. That was a lot of incredible information. I see we were getting some good questions. We're going to hold those till the end and ask those once we finish with all of our panelists. But I want to highlight some things that I heard you say, Kara, that I think are really valuable. One, of course, you ended with, we need to work together. And that's something that, from my perspective at the Coalition Against Homelessness, is absolutely true. Is housing and homelessness are nonpartisan issues. And so when you're speaking with Republicans or Democrats, as Kara, you've mentioned, you have to come to them with your data and your stories, and you have to approach it as though this is something that we all should be caring about and we all should be taking action on. And I so value the way that you approach that. The other thing I really want to highlight is all of the effort you've put into building those relationships. You've mentioned 2 legislators who are actually wonderful champions and great people in our work to prevent and end homelessness at the state level. And the work that you've done to build those relationships, to build that trust, to have their personal contact information via social media and the way that they reach out to you, you're making yourself available as an expert to them, which is also so incredibly valuable. I mean, this is a 2-way relationship. They should be learning from us as we are also learning from them. And they should be able to count on us when they have questions. So thank you for elevating those approaches and the way that you address this issue, regardless of party within our state legislature. So thank you. Katie, the last question that I have, well, not the last, but the next question is for you. Kara mentioned data. And so we know that data tells a really compelling story, but so do personal narratives. Why is it so important that we empower individuals who have experienced homelessness to speak with elected officials? And what can we do to support that?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I would absolutely agree that I think data tells a really compelling story. I think data is a really important tool that we use in our advocacy. It helps us to paint the scope of the need. We're able to say, this is how many people are experiencing homelessness in our area. This is the demographics of those people. This is what their needs are. You can quantify needs, you can quantify how many people need it. And I think that that's really powerful, to show the scope of the need, to show the pervasiveness of the need, and to show what people are facing in some really tangible, quantifiable ways. But I think that data in and of itself, can sometimes, you can hear that, but you can still feel removed from the situation. And I think that it's the personal stories, it's the real life experiences that take that data and make it human, that remind us that we're not just talking about numbers, we're talking about people. And I also think that sometimes data can simplify things. It can, you can get things in neat graphs and in, clean numbers. But the reality is that human experience is messy and that people don't fit neatly into boxes. And so what works for one person may not work for another person. And so I think sometimes we can be tricked by data to think like, oh, this is simple. This many people have substance use, so we need more treatment programs, right? But we're not thinking about what the complexity of their story is, or what their multiple needs and identities are. And so by having people tell their stories, they get to speak to what it is like to experience homelessness. I can understand something in a theoretical way, but it's not until I really either live it myself or talk to somebody who has lived it that I really understand it on a deeper level and really come to value it in a different way. I think stories help to drive it home, to make it human, to make it personal, and I think to make it real, to really just understand that it's people, and that homelessness, the ways that homelessness impacts you as a person, the ways that it impacts your mental health, the ways that it impacts the way you view yourself, the way you navigate the world, how you feel empowered. And I think so. So I think that stories are crucial in that sense. And I think stories are crucial in helping us to really understand the complexity of homelessness and the diversity of the needs and the diversity of experience. And then I would also say too, it helps by making it human. It no longer becomes like an us and them issue. It becomes a we. We're connected in that human aspect of a true story of the impact. We're able to feel empathy. We're able to relate to our own experiences, and that can drive passion and fuel and really help to get elected officials behind the issue, because now they understand the human impact. It feels more real. It feels more tangible why this need is so urgent, because these are human beings who are affected by homelessness. And I think so that's really crucial. I also think another reason that it's crucial is because I think one of the ways that we unintentionally perpetuate injustices in our systems and in our policy is that policy is often created by people who are removed from the situation, who have not lived through that experience. And I think giving the benefit of the doubt, I think that there's well-intentioned policy development that's trying to address the issue, but we are the experts of our own experiences and we know best what we need. And so I think like by that policy is going to be best driven by the voices of those most impacted. The way we're going to dismantle the injustices in these systems is by letting those of us who have experienced homelessness be driving the ways that policy is developed, by us saying, these are my express needs, this is what needs to happen, this is what I need, and then working to make policy that enacts that. And so I think that's crucial, that our policy, we need to be working and moving towards a place where policy is developed by those who are impacted by that policy, who have firsthand experience, who are living that. And so that's why it's so crucial to get people with those lived experiences in front of elected officials, or to help them become elected officials themselves to where they can drive that policy change as well. But I think that until we get policy driven by the real stories, by people who are impacted by it, we're going to continue to see these systemic issues happen again and again, due to lack of knowledge of what it really is like to experience the situation.
Thank you, Katie. And to echo that, I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with legislators who I have presented data to over and over again, and they can never remember the numbers, but they remember that one individual who they spoke to, who talked to them about their experience, and they remember helping them. And that connection drives them to the bigger question of how do we resolve this for more than just that one individual. So Katie, everything you said, I've seen in practice and I've seen it work. I do want to kind of ask a little bit deeper, how have you seen others empower individuals to be able to tell those stories? I mean, we can bring them to Lansing, we can take them to DC, we can help them in what I think is a marvelous idea of helping them get to positions of power as elected officials themselves. But do you have any insight for us about how we can be empowering folks to participate?
Yeah, I think a number of ways. I think it's as you engage in this work, you come across people who are passionate and who are advocating for themselves at the local level, who are saying, hey, this is an issue, this is I'm not okay with this. The way the system is working is not meeting my needs. And I think it's through working with those persons to try and address it on the local level, and then building that relationship, building that trust, then you can say, hey, your story has been so powerful with me here locally. Can we partner together to talk to officials at the state level, at the federal level? Would you be willing to engage in this? And I find just like by talking with people, by engaging with people, by listening to them, it doesn't take, many people do want their stories to be heard, do want to be heard. And so it's really just creating those linkages, listening and building those relationships on the local level, and then creating those linkages and building those relationships with your elected officials, and trying to then create the links between the two to say, hey, I've got some really passionate people who have some really great ideas, and I would love for you guys to connect and to talk about them. And so I think it's a lot of it is relationship building, trust building. I think one of the barriers is like a distrust of the system, because the system has been like I said, it's perpetuated injustices, and it's it's caused a lot of harm. And I think people have an innate distrust of people who are affiliated with the system. So I think it's also, when we build relationships with people, we have to do what we say we're going to do, and we have to be honest about like where those barriers are, and meet people where they're at. And so in some of the ways, we have to rebuild trust that's been broken down by years of the broken system as well, and try to build coalition in that way, and do what we can to be addressing the issues on the local level, and then be creating platforms for the voices to be elevated to higher levels of state government, county government, national government, and so really I think it's both building those relationships and then creating links, I would say, is like the biggest thing that I found.
That's
Does that
wonderful.
answer your question? Okay.
Absolutely. No, just some takeaways for us as we're thinking about some of this work. And I think the linkages and the trust building is crucial. So thank you. So my next question, I'm going to ask all three of our panelists. We often think that advocacy directed toward elected officials is an extra thing that we have to do on top of all of our other work. How have you been able to build that into your existing workload? And for social workers especially, what kind of trainings or tools do you use in your work with clients and guests that are also helpful when you're speaking with decision makers? And I don't know who wants to go first with that one. Kara, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I can go first. So a couple of things I have found. Sometimes I'll actually hit the issue up to my executive director, because it might, with him being the executive director of Allegan County Community Mental Health, might carry a little more weight to it than what I do as a supervisor for a program. Not to say that I'm not important, but sometimes having a heavy hitter go at a policy sometimes is better, or having the extra support. So maybe I give voice to it, but then having my executive director come in alongside me to also write a letter on behalf as an agent, the agency representative, really making an impact for our community. And it's really interesting, as a licensed professional counselor, I find a lot of my counseling skills come in very handy when talking to elected representatives. I think one thing I've used in a little bit different way is motivational interviewing. We use it with clients to kind of help them with, getting them to engagement and kind of into kind of the cycles of stages of change, kind of help them to move forward in those stages of change. But I think we can still use that in a little bit different way with prompting questions to our elected officials, especially if they don't see the need, and really questioning their assumptions behind that in a very respectful way, of course. But even simple counseling skills like, well, tell me more about what you think about this, or I think in Allegan County we have a lot of representatives. Sometimes they don't even see it's an issue, but that's because in Allegan County we have no shelters, and so the homelessness just isn't quite visibly apparent, but doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And so sometimes challenging very respectfully the assumptions that may be inherent in what they're saying, and sometimes responding a question with a question kind of gets them to think a little bit more deeper about the issue. I have found those helpful myself. Not to say I want to counsel representatives per se, but it's just sometimes those techniques can be very helpful, not just with the clients we serve, but with our elected representatives in challenging, I think, especially the assumptions that are behind things, or if they think a certain policy is working well, again, coming at that with another question and challenging, maybe it's working okay, but something else may be better, and how can I get at that and bring someone to at least a 180-degree turn, maybe not 360, but maybe a 180, to really start thinking about the issue a little bit differently with more probing questions, instead of just educating and feeding them information, but questioning assumptions, questioning their perspective on things, and hopefully bringing them to a place of at least entertaining the idea from a different perspective, or being willing to look more into it, doing more research on it themselves, or having a staffer look more into it. All of that can be helpful to promote change in policy and regulation that will impact the people we serve as well. So that's kind of how I've approached it.
Thank you. I love the idea that we already have the skills and the tools that we need to be effective advocates with policy change. So thank you for kind of just calling that out. Lynn, would you like to answer, how have you built advocacy into your schedule? What kind of tools do you use that you already have in your basket?
Sure. Well, I have all these notes about that question, but then I have all these other notes because what I'm hearing from Kara and from Katie is so brilliant that I'm sure you'll hear from me later. So thank you so much for all of that great information that you've been providing. So I'm not only the COC director, but I'm also the HMIS system administrator. And I tell you that because key for me is really assessing capacity for what level of advocacy you can do. I think what I found myself frustrated because there's so much great work that can be done in advocacy, and I want to do it all, and I always have trouble prioritizing what is actually going to fit into my workload. And I think what I would recommend is recognizing that whatever you do is great, better than great, and if you do a little bit more, a little bit better. So whatever you're doing is going to be effective and helpful in the whole scheme of things. Oh, now I've lost my train of thought. When I think about people in human services, we do want to do it all. And so, and because advocacy is really, the Lakeshore Housing Alliance is a part of United Way. Advocacy is a key effort of United Ways across the world, and so we want to make sure we're dedicating some portion of our work to advocacy. So I would really recommend, like we are doing at our local United Way, what can we do, and one of the ways that we've been able to work with people with lived experience, people who are experiencing homelessness, is in getting them engaged at the COC level, and reaching out to people who have been engaged in the system, are part of this, the system, services from the system, and bringing them into our COC experience. at the larger table, at smaller work groups, at the executive committee, our primary decision-making body, but making sure that we're prepping people for those experiences, right? That just plopping someone down in the middle of a room of 30 people whom they've never met before may not be the most effective way to hear a voice that is important to hear. So I know that the people who with lived experience who have sat at our table, I've spent time with them ahead of time, just kind of orienting them to the process, orienting them to what happens around the table, and then asking them, where do you feel more comfortable? At the larger group? Would you prefer being in a smaller group? And that, I think, is really helpful, and it just gives them, and because we talk about advocacy efforts at those tables, people begin to become a part of those conversations as well. So that's what my takeaway there is, just assess your capacity and be okay with whatever it is you can do.
That's so important for us to hear, especially now when we're all working beyond our existing capacity. But I also love that you're essentially talking about building a culture of advocacy and starting small and building up from that, so that everybody kind of is invited to participate and knows how to participate. And I think that's also so important from an organizational perspective about how we can call people into this work. Katie, how about you?
Yeah, I think I want to largely echo what's already been said for a lot of that. I really appreciate what Lynn was saying about knowing your capacity and honoring what you're able to do in that capacity. I think that when I was thinking about this question, that was my initial thought was, I wish I was doing more. So I think, just taking that and owning that and then honoring, whatever you can do is good. And I do think that is really true and really important. And I think one of the things that I found too that helps to integrate advocacy more into my daily work is trying to just stay in the loop of what's going on, trying to be as informed as I can about policy changes. One of the things that I think has been really helpful for me is the Legislative Action Committee, Laurel, that you manage, that you keep updates about legislation and the work that Micah's doing to advocate and opportunities we have to advocate, so that you kind of take some of that legwork of having to research things and stay up to date, and then for those of us who are really busy, you're also very busy too, but for those of us on the call, then we get to receive that and then find ways to plug in that way, and that's been really helpful too. So just building off of existing efforts is something I would say. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. People are doing the work, people are doing the research, there are opportunities, so just trying to find ways to keep yourself updated so that then you can find places to plug in, I think is really helpful. And just allowing building off of work others are doing, so you don't feel the weight of having to do it all yourself, I think is really huge. And coalition building as well, so like talking with other advocates and knowing what they're doing, and being inspired by what they're doing, or just knowing like, okay, you're doing this right now, I can focus on my work, but next time, like, I can then advocate in this area. And so I think that's been a really crucial role for me too. And then I think also I think Lynn was also speaking to this as well. One of the things that's been crucial for me is recognizing that advocacy can be done in the day-to-day, and like little actions that we do in the day-to-day are works of advocacy as well. So whenever I manage the grievance process in our continuum of care, so whenever clients feel that their rights have been violated, they are able to file a grievance, and then we work to investigate that, and then to make amends if possible for whatever ways the rights have been violated. And I found just by engaging with clients to talk to them about what their experience has been, and then working to take action to rectify it, that's an act of advocacy, hearing their story and then honoring their story, and then working to do what we can to change the system to better meet their needs, and to hopefully not continue to perpetuate the harm that was caused in that moment. Or hearing something making connections, I think, is a form of advocacy. Being in a meeting and hearing something that's happened and hearing that experience, and then going to another meeting with a different group of people and giving voice to that story again, or advocating in that way. So I think some of the little day-to-day things that we do, like just being intentional in those, and also just recognizing that I think advocacy can come in many forms, and it doesn't have to be the grand, it's not, I don't know, I said grand, but it, I think sometimes we build up like that we've really got to, I put a lot of pressure on myself that advocacy has to look a certain way, and it must be time consuming because it requires all of this work to do. But I think that advocacy also comes in our day-to-day tasks, and in just making those connections and remembering what we're told and honoring the stories and of fellow colleagues as well as clients, and just doing what we can to stay true to remind our that's for me, the mission is to try and create opportunities to make the system more just and to make the system better reflect the needs of those who are interacting with the system. And so I think also just like regrounding yourself in what your purpose and your passion is helps as well.
If I could echo a couple of things, I think, the grievance and appeals process we need to utilize more often, not just with housing, but mental health and substance use services too. I know within my agency, being a community mental health, behavioral health provider, I advocate very heavily when clients' rights are not being, they don't have the rights given to them. The first thing I'll tell my staff is, let's help them with a grievance and appeal, or ask them if they want to do that, and then help them with that. The same thing for fair housing. If someone's rights are being violated, ask that person, would you like me to help you with a fair housing complaint? Because a lot of that stuff is all counted. So there's data that goes behind it, and then that can be used to help promote change in the long run as well. And so at the local level, especially at your agency level, if you have a grievance and appeals process, help your clients utilize those processes that are in place, be it the behavioral health system, the housing system, or any other systems of care that you work in, because that can make an impact as well. And the other thing is, as far as the advocacy and getting the time in, I think it's doing even those little things with a grievance appeal, because that can be a big changer in the long run. But I also promote to my staff, if something isn't happening well at the local level, we've gone to our funders and that's not working, then, encouraging your staff to connect with a representative of your local level to say, hey, this person is entitled to this and they're not receiving that. If it's a housing right or whatever, or person. I know with eviction diversion, we've had some issues that come up, and we went to Fred Upton about an issue with a specific client, and it was really helpful, and eventually it got resolved at that level. And there was just so many things in play at the local level. It wasn't moving forward very well. So we got Fred Upton's office involved. They were very helpful. A lot of collaboration between the housing provider, representative, our agency. I believe Mishta as well helped out to help bring about a resolution to keep that person housed. And so those things too, I always, implore my staff to connect to representatives when it's warranted, especially in individual cases, because usually that individual case is just the one that comes at that point in time. But sometimes representatives will then ask, well, does this happen a lot, or how often does this happen? And that's where you can bring your data out, your HMS data, and say, this is how often this happens in our community. So of course it's going to be different for each community based on your numbers, but it's another way of bringing in the advocacy that way as well.
That's perfect. Thank you, Kara. And I just want to remind everyone, as we're talking about like all of these different actions, our elected officials work for us. And so these are examples of ways that we can have them help in the work that we're doing. So thank you for utilizing that and encouraging staff to do so as well. I told you all that these women were amazing and wonderful advocates. And I hope that you're all learning from them and are able to take some of this home into your practices as well. We have just a couple minutes left, and we have gotten a couple questions. if we don't get to all of them, we'll try and follow up. And if you have additional questions, please, again, use the chat box to send them in. This question, Kara, is for you specifically. You mentioned reading officials' platforms to understand how to engage with them. Where is the best place to find that information?
You can Google Republican platform and Democrat platform, and it's usually the top hit on Google. You'll get a PDF and just read through them. And then really take kind of out of that, I just kind of make myself a little, I don't say PowerPoint, but a outline of the issues that really impact housing, because we know it's a complex issue. It's not just housing, but specifically within those platforms, you can find not just, well, Democrat Party specifically speaks to housing and homelessness more directly than the Republican platform, but the Republican platform, you can find the inroads by the different policies that they promote with smaller government, just deregulation, because we know sometimes regulations get in the way of housing people, so helping people get housing. So yeah, I usually kind of make an outline of what's really going to be my inroads depending on the party platform. So.
Can I jump in there just with just a local perspective on that? This is something that we're challenged with all the time, where people feel, they come to us and they say, we didn't know this was happening. And so we're always struggling with how to best get information out to people, because that is, we want to hear what people's perspectives are. So we want to make sure that all of the, areas are addressed. But one of the things I just wanted to point out also is that most local meetings, at least of city council or county commissions, are at this point either being live streamed or recorded. And so if you have an hour or two to just have it playing in the background while you're doing whatever you're doing, making dinner or listening to it later, that's a great way to hear what they're talking about. Go to your city, county, township webpage and look at the agendas that are coming up for meetings. That doesn't take a particularly long time. Just a great idea to kind of see what they're talking about at the local level. I know it does take it's really hard to get information to everybody. So that's just one way that people in the community can access information.
Thank you for that. And I also want to add that at least for our members of Congress and state legislators, they also often have rather good bios on their website. So if you want to know not just the party platform, but the individual's perspective on things, you can go to their website, look at their media releases about what they're supporting, check what kind of bills they are sponsoring or co-sponsoring. All of that is a really helpful tool to be able to understand how to speak to them based on which party that they represent and their own individual experiences and perspectives on things. Next question, and I think this could be for anybody. When you do your advocacy work, do you do so as a representative of your housing agency, organization, or as an individual constituent?
I would say both. I know for me, when I advocate, like I said, I live in Kent County. I'm a constituent of Kent County, but I'm also a constituent of the state of Michigan and of the United States. So my advocacy, I focus on data more locally for Allegan County because I know that data well. So I come at every representative as a representative of my agency, but also as an individual who's paying taxes and their salaries, and look at it at both ways. And I know with the MICA legislative advocacy days that they host, I go to both Kent County and Allegan County representatives and talk to all of them. And I tweak how I discuss it a little bit based on whether I'm coming at it from as an individual who lives in the community, or if it's because I'm working in that community as the housing provider. So I tailor my responses a little bit, but.
Thank you. I'm going to jump in because we're just coming up at the end of the session. We have a question that I'd like to get to, but if people have to hop off, I understand. But before you do please make sure that you're checking out with us for your CEUs. Again, just put your name in at the chat box saying that you're checking out for CEUs, and we'll make sure to process that for you. Katie, Lynn, did either of you want to answer the question about how you advocate as an individual versus agency or organization? You're good? Okay. So for those who want to stick around for just a couple minutes, I think this is a fascinating question. It's also a hard question. When you see policy that doesn't have, let me start over. When you see a policy that doesn't seem to be solving the problem, but more of a Band-Aid solution, how do you proceed to unravel policy that negatively affects the community you serve and redirect that energy to a solution? It's a hard one. So I says no one's jumping in on that one. I think you may have stumped us. Perhaps I should have let everybody go before asking that question. But I think that one thing that I want to acknowledge with this question is that, yes, often we are thinking about how can we resolve this emergent need? How can we take care of someone in this crisis moment? And so those solutions are very helpful or can be very helpful, but we do need to be thinking about long-term policy solutions and how we can build systems and how we can build community solutions that kind of go towards the bigger picture. And so I don't have an answer for that question either. I was hoping one of our local folks could have some really great examples of something they've done. But I do want to acknowledge that that is something that we always have to be thinking about with our advocacy is how can we look at policies that are perhaps short-sighted or short-term or perhaps don't solve the bigger problem, and how can we, as you say, unravel some of that and start thinking about the bigger picture. So Katie, Kara, Lynn, do either of you want to jump in on that?
Sure. I was just going to add that I don't think I have I think this is the question that we're all trying to figure out and work towards, because I think we see a lot of policies that unfortunately are Band-Aids, and so I think we're still trying to figure it out. One thing though is if it's a local policy that we have some say over, like we can change that local policy. I think that's, or really just with any policy, I do think that's really where that building relationships and finding place for the voices of those who are impacted by the system is so crucial, because then by talking with people about what their experiences are and how that policy has impacted them, and then talking with them about what their actual needs are and what they could see, like what would better meet their needs in that situation, by gathering that data and understanding, as talking with people, like what they feel could actually help. I think that's a step towards dismantling it and creating something that's more effective, is by having those conversations with people to understand what the impact of that policy is on them and what they feel they would need instead, like what would actually meet their needs. I think conversations in this are crucial and really vital in helping us to get to solutions, because again, people are the experts of their own experiences and often know what they need. And if the system isn't meeting those needs, then by understanding what those needs are, then we can work to advocate to change that. Or if it's something local and we have the power to change it, then we can work to start to develop new policy that's better informed. That's one idea.
Yeah, no, I think I would agree that it's framing it in the long term as opposed to imagining that it's going to happen overnight, right? So you have your goal in mind, but there's strategies that you work with people with lived experience, people in your community, with your elected officials, with your allies. How do you strategize to move towards that goal? I think it's really important. And so that is, what, like you just ended, Katie, by saying it's really building those relationships and making sure that you're connecting with your allies on a regular basis, because you know that this is where I'm headed, and I need to make sure that this is continually on people's minds.
Yeah, and I would say, more probably for state and federal levels as well, is knowing the data and how many people are impacted by that negative policy and how they're impacted by that policy. Because I think especially at the federal level, they do look at, they're not as relationally tied to their local districts the way our local representatives and their state representatives are. Sometimes because they're in DC, they're a little more removed. So I think bringing in that personal connection as much as you can, but then knowing how many people in your state, in your jurisdiction are impacted by that negative policy, to say it's not just impacting one or two people or a few, like this is impacting a majority and this is how it's impacting them. And I think specifically, I look at Republican policies a lot, and if they are really, looking at giving the trust back to the person, the individual freedoms is what they're looking for. And there's a policy that's impeding access to housing because of, giving the individual the power to access housing, then speak to that and say, okay, your platform speaks to individual freedoms, and how is this policy, promoting individual freedoms? And so I think that's why sometimes, especially at the federal level, if you know those platforms, it can be helpful to kind of, put that in a succinct email or letter to the representative. So.
Thank you. And we've kept everyone 6 minutes longer than we said we would. Thank you for everyone for attending. I did drop in the chat box the link for Micah's website if you're interested in learning more about the Legislative Action Committee or our Advocacy Day that Katie and Kara mentioned. And thank you for doing so. Again, drop in your name if you need CEUs. It looks like we have a fairly decent lunch break. The next plenary is at 1 o'clock. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much to our panelists. And I hope you all have a wonderful day and are ready to go out there and advocate for changes to prevent homelessness. Thank you. Bye. Kara, I'm going to stick around for a little bit just to make sure everybody gets off okay, but you should feel free to go.
Okay, I wasn't sure. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, I didn't see any more questions come in, but if anybody pops one in, I'll let you know. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
Okay.